Let me just share my screen. 1 second. And put this. All right. Anyway, thank you, Vic, for the invitation. Um, I'm as I mentioned earlier, I'm glad or I'm happy to do this, but I'm not happy to do it at the same time. Meaning that um, it's said that this has to be shared, that it's not out there already. But anyway, I babble a little bit, so I got to get into my groove. But so thank you for everybody for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about a part of the results of a survey that I did looking at the long-term impact of adoption, right? Um, so we don't have that much time. So if you want to know my story, you can listen to it I was interviewed by Damon Davis, and you can find it. I was also on a podcast of Pulled by the Root, but I did that under a pseudonym out of respect for my daughter. It was my first it's where I found my first voice, I guess I could say, in talking about my experience. And I did it under a pseudonym out of respect for my daughter. The next one that I did with Damon, I started to talk about my research. And ethically, I couldn't do it as in a pseudonym anymore. But anyway, if you want to know which one it was on Pulled by the Root, just message me and I'll let you know. But anyway, so I am a first mother and I am in reunion. And I had my first year in reunion was a whirlwind, right? Um, I met my daughter called me. I was in my office. She called. I said, "Can I meet you?" She said, "Yes." I said, "When?" Uh, and we met that day, right? She lives about an 8-hour drive from me, so we met midway, 4 hours each. Uh, I ended up spending the weekend with her. Shortly after that week, she FaceTimed. I 20 years later, I had two other children. So she FaceTimed with her sisters, and uh, so it was the two nuclear families. You know, she sent me flowers on Mother's Day, which was the next weekend, which was amazing. I had shared before that for 40 years, how could I celebrate Mother's Day, right? How could I celebrate Mother's Day? And so here she is. She sends me flowers. It was amazing. Um, we did all things. It was a whirlwind. And after 11 months of being in reunion, I officially adopted my daughter, right? So I officially adopted my daughter. But then, as we all know, in this roller coaster, we had some hard times, right? Um, Shortly after, there was a series of deaths. There were three major deaths in 9 months. Um, my father, her grandfather, died 1 year from the day that they met, right? Her adoptive brother, which was the last of her adoptive family, passed away. My mother, her grandmother, uh, passed away um, right before she was going to bring her daughter to meet her her great grandmother, right? Um, and she also met her first father and members of that side of her family. And I put that in there because I think that was a significant event in her life also. And so, not surprising, she needed to pull away, right? She needed to pull back. She needed space with the relationship. But me, I'm left with questions. I hope my friends in the UK understand the joke here better than my American colleagues, right? The genesis of the project, right? So the genesis of my research then was I was trying to find some answers, right? Um, we had this unbelievable year, and then and then not, right? I wanted to know, kind of like I wanted to know what I did wrong, right? I wanted to know what I did wrong. I wanted to know what I could have done different. I wanted to know what I could do to make things better. And so I went to look at the research. And for any of you who have looked into the research on long-term outcomes of adoption, you're not going to be surprised that I didn't find anything. I found very little. And what I did find didn't really speak to my questions. Um, the the sample size was extremely small. And so I decided, well, let's just ask the questions, right? So I decided that I was going to ask people and and try to find some answers. Originally, I was only interested in reunion, right? Because we're all a little self-centered, right? We're all a little self, let's be honest, right? I wanted my answers. I wanted questions. I had my questions and I wanted my questions answered. And I created a survey. But I had the survey vetted, right? So different people went out and looked at the survey and gave me feedback, and through that feedback, the survey grew, right? It grew from only being focused on reunions to being focused on to expanding it to other adopted adoption related topics. Um, it included things on interracial and international adoption experiences, but the most important revision looked at the mental health of individuals, right? So, so I got this survey out, right? We created it. I got it out. Um, this was basically an unfunded, right? This was basically an unfunded research. I'm, I got $2,000 for some startup money. It basically paid for um, the raffle at the end of the survey. If you did the survey, that there was a raffle, and basically it paid for the raffle. It paid a little bit for the Facebook um, advertisement, but But anyway, so um, it was distributed basically online. Um, the I created a Facebook page, put the link for the survey there. I reached out to adoption related organizations to see if they would uh, help promote it. I consciously um, made posts, right, hoping to get more and more people, and I ended up getting over 1,300 people to complete the survey, which was kind of amazing because um, the research that's out there, they have an end size of double digits, right? So to have 1,300, it was amazing, right? Now, who were these 1,300 people? Um, we had mostly adoptees, right? About 900 adoptees, about 400 first mothers, and 7 first fathers. Um, the population was mostly women, and mostly white women, and mostly people in the United States. So the population was kind of overwhelmingly white women from the United States. However, um, it did go internationally, and the only continent that didn't have somebody um, answering it was Antarctica, right? Antarctica was the only continent that didn't have representation, right? It's because Antarctica doesn't have any representation, right? But anyway, so what did all those people, say, and what was the conclusion of the study? Well, um, there is a long-term negative effect on individuals who are separated from their other at birth. I'm using the term other uh, to refer to your counterpart, right? So if you're a first mother, your other is your child. If you are an adoptee, your other is your first mother, right? I didn't make up that term. That term is kind of out there, and I think it speaks well because it's really kind of a dyad, right? It's the mother-child dyad. So there is a long-term effect of adoption on this pairing, right? So how did I come to that conclusion? Well, I'm going to break it up into two sections. One, I'm going to talk about the narratives that people gave, right? The qualitative, and then I'm going to talk about the numbers, the quantitative bits of the data, right? And so um, I asked people, just what do you want people to know, right? Just at the end of the survey, there was just this blanket question. What, kind of what do you want people to know? And adoptees um, had six, when you looked at the adoptees, they had six overarching themes, right? And one was trauma and loss. And I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of quotes, but there are a few quotes that I want to talk about, right? Um, this quote: as an adoptee, I want people to know that is trauma. All the love my adoptive parents gave me couldn't repair the pain from my first mother ignoring me, right? I I think this quote is important because all too often um, people will say, "Well, that was just your experience. You had a bad adoption, right? But there was a lot, right? Of these quotes that say it doesn't make a difference the quality of the adoptive parent, right? The quality of the adoptive parent um, doesn't take away the pain that exists from losing your first mother, right? The analogy I've come up with these days is, you break your arm, right? You break your arm, uh, it gets repaired, and you go to the best hospital in the world, the best hospital in the world, and they set your arm, and it's all good, but your arm is never going to be the same, right? When it's wet, it's still going to ache, right? No amount of good medicine repairs that initial damage, right? And I think that all too often, um, the experiences that are out there, people are able to say, "Oh, well, you just had a bad experience," right? It's like, no, it's that initial separation, right? And the other big thing is identity and belonging, right? That adoptees never feel like they belong, right? Um, that they were just placed into a family, which they were, right? And they never felt like they belong. That's supported by a question where I say, where do you feel you belong, right? Do you belong? Do you feel, for those who are in reunion, do you feel as if you belong in your adoptive family, your maternal family, paternal family, or nowhere, right? And nearly 56% of adoptees don't feel as if they belong someplace, right? The other categories that adoptees talk about is this issue of secrecy, right? I found this quote: secrecy in science doesn't work. Withholding information does more damage to us than our competitors, right? There's a tremendous amount of secrecy, and that's I'm going to talk about secrecy in a minute, but there's an organization out there that says we're only as sick as our sickest secret, right? Um, right? We need things to be in the light, right? And then, of course, this issue about society, right? The need for support and call for adoption reform. Interesting, when we talk about what mothers say, let me just say, when we talk about mothers say that they echo what adoptees say. The first thing is they talk about this trauma, right? And and I use these two particular quotes here because I think it talks to this issue about mothers don't get over it, right? Here, here is a woman who's 49 years, right? So her daughter is or child or son, I don't know, is son, right, is 50, right? And she she still cries on his birthday, right? And he was a product of rape, right? It doesn't, it's kind of like it doesn't matter how you were conceived. Your mother still loved you, right? Um, and this one, my daughter is 53 years old. That means that this woman is probably close to 70, right? So this 70-year-old woman still can't talk about her pregnancy and her experience without crying. To me, I think that just really talks about the depth of this despair that um, women are feeling, right? Then they go into coercion and regret, right? Um, Only 19% of the women who answered the survey said that they were in control, right? That they were in control, that right, that they had power at the time of uh, their child's adoption, um, which is kind of unbelievable, right? That basically 80%, let's go with 80%, 80% feel like that their child was taken from them. But society views it and as these women didn't want their children, right? When 80% of them felt that their child was taken. Um, Nearly 90% uh, want to do it, want to do over, right? They want to raise their child. If they could do it over again, they would raise their child. There's one quote that I have, and I don't know exactly where to put it. I don't know if I want to put it in the trauma or in the regret, but there's one quote that said something along the line of, um, I didn't just lose my daughter. I lost our future. She lost being a big sister. My other children lost having a sister. A granddaughter lost having, and a bunch of lists. And then it said um, something along the line of, "Why didn't anybody tell me?" Right? It just, I don't know if that's regret. I don't know if that's trauma or regret. I have to play with that a little bit. But and then this next line about how it impacts everybody's relationship, right? Uh, it's the tragedy of my life. It ruined my ability to have a personal relationship due to trust issues. I trust no one. I hated my mother my whole life because she forced me to do that. She's dead, and I still hate her. I don't know about you, but I can feel, it's palpable, right? It's palpable on how this affected this woman's entire life, right? And this, she's dead, and I still hate her. Um, what a thing to have to carry around with you, right? But anyway, so then there's the desire for, again, what do mothers want people to know? That there should be um, trying to keep the family together. There needs to be support and counseling, and there's issues with the complexity in reunion, right? But as I mentioned earlier, I was going to get back to the secrecy, right? Um, there's secrecy in adoption, right? From the very beginning. From the very beginning, um, birth mothers are sent away, right? They're hiding their pregnancy. They're not telling anybody. Then there are adoptive parents. I've read some situations where there were women who pretended that they were pregnant before they brought their child home, right? They don't tell they don't tell their adopted child that they were adopted, right? And then it continues with adoptees not sharing that they were adopted. So not surprisingly, there's secrecy in reunions, right? Um, Now, where does the secrecy start from, right? Um, Originally, the first mother remained silent. Again, I asked, why were you silent? Why couldn't you, why didn't you say anything? 43% of the women who mentioned the feeling of being shamed, right? They were shamed. They were afraid of judgment, pain, society. You can read that, right? And then they stay silent for the same reasons, right? These asterisks, they're the same choices. They were ashamed, they're guilty, they're afraid that they're going to be rejected or there's going to be judgment, society pressures, right? And then privacy and respect for their others, which is also going to be on the adoptee side also, right? That some first mothers, their their other is not public, so out of respect for them, they're not also, all right? So adoptees, why do adoptees keep their reunion secret? There's a bunch of themes. They have 5 themes, but the biggest theme is the adoptive family, right? 54% of adoptees mentioned that they keep their reunions at least partly a secret due to their adoptive families, and there are sub reasons here, right? There are sub reasons. Some feel that they want to protect their adoptive parents' feelings, right? They're concerned that their adoptive parents are going to be jealous or feel betrayed. And then they go into issues about not being sure that their adoptive parents understand, right? Understand adoption. And some of them say, you know, they, there's too much baggage between me and my adoptive family for me to share my feelings, that they didn't feel safe. That's it's kind of amazing that 54% of adoptees are not talking about their reunions because of their concerns about their adoptive families, right? The other issues, the other categories are, their own personal feelings, right? Many of the adoptees express that they feel that they're being disloyal because they want to find their first families. That somehow or other that means that they're not being respectful for their adoptive parents, right? And then again, outside pressures, timing, and here the same with first mothers respecting their child's wishes. Sometimes there are first mothers who aren't out, and so their child is also not out. All right, but that's what they're saying, right? That's what they're saying. Now, what does the data, right? And what do the numbers say, right? There was a question, do you feel pain from the loss of your other, right? 93%, 94% of adoptees and 86% of first mothers definitely feel pain because of their loss, right? That they suffer pain, right? And then they develop some unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with it, right? So we got 95% of adoptees saying, yeah, I've developed some unhealthy behaviors. And 85% of first mothers saying, yeah, I have some unhealthy behaviors because of that. Now, here's where the rubber hits the road, right? We can all say we feel uncomfortable. We can all say we feel pain. Well, what does that pain equate to, right? Some of us may have heard the body keeps the score, right? That our body responds to stress, right? And first mothers, right, lose about 15 years of their life because of this pain that they suffer, right? The average expectancy of a woman is about 80 years old, right? However, I asked in the survey, I asked adoptees, is your mother alive or deceased, right? And if they said that they were deceased, I asked them another series of questions, and one of them was, how old were they when they passed, right? Um, and so you can see, you can see this flow, right? Only 88, I'm sorry, only 18% lived longer than 80 years, as opposed to 50%, right? Now, I am assuming a normal distribution, right? I couldn't find, right? So, so this 65 to 70 is actually the median of my population, right? Where 50% are above, 50% are below. Um, the mean, right? The average is a little bit different than the median, but in a standard distribution, they all fall out the same. I could only find when I looked, I could only find the average life expectancy. I'm assuming the normal distribution, right? Um, but but here we have 45% of the women are um, live longer than 70 years old, right? So between 65 and 70 is the median, right? Um, we also I also asked if they had if they were deceased, what was the cause, right? What was the cause, right? When we look at the suicide rate, at least in the United States, according to the CDC, which is the Center for Disease and Control, um, about 5 out of 100,000 women die by suicide, right? So that's a 0.0057% die of suicide in the United States, right? In the United States, anyhow, right? Out of the 245 adoptees who reported their mothers were deceased, 9 listed their cause of death of suicide. And I think it could have been higher, right? Um, there was some narrative that suggested that maybe their mother committed suicide, but they weren't 100% sure. And so since they didn't deem it suicide, I didn't count it as suicide, but there were at least 2 other women, or 2 other adoptees who described it as mother's death, and the likelihood is it could have been a suicide, which would make the percentages even higher. But anyway, but using the 9 out of the 245, we get a 3.67% of first mothers die by suicide, which makes them more than 600 times more likely to die by suicide than the average woman in the United States, right? You can see how that math comes out, but you can multiply 643, right, by the rate, and that's where you get the numbers. That's 600 times more likely to die by suicide, right? So, what are some of the other long-term mental effects, right? Um, we report that we are emotionally distant, right? We need control. We avoid things. I found this interesting. Everybody overeats, right? Everybody overeats, but adoptees and first mothers restrict their eating more than the general population. But to the ones that, to the more serious, I guess you could say, long-term effects, we isolate ourselves, right? We isolate ourselves, which prevents us from healing, right? Um, we tend to, 25% of us, both adoptees, and you'll notice how similar we are, first mothers and adoptees, right? 45, 46% isolate, 25.5, 24.7 are hyper identify themselves as being hypersexual, having a hypersexuality, right? Um, Interesting. uh, that the drug use between um, our population and the general population is about the same, but uh, we abuse alcohol at much higher rates. Um, and one hypothesis here, and it's been shared and talked about, is that we've all heard the term of a good adoptee, right? We've all turned, and I say we all have heard. I'm, a, you know, I don't mean to. If you haven't heard it, I don't mean to, you know. But there's the term, a good adoptee, right? Um, I can I can drink and still be a good adoptee, right? I can drink and still be, a good first mother, right? So that I don't think there's ever that term, right? If I use drugs, I'm not a good adoptee, right? Right. But anyway, I found that very interesting. Um, we have 16%, 12% that say that they harmed themselves. Um, but we also have 21, 22% who've attempted suicide versus 0.06% of the general population. Now, we have long heard, right, that the conventional wisdom says that adoptees are 4 times more likely to, to commit suicide, right? That comes from a study that was done kind of in the United States, and it looked at um, individuals between the ages of 12 and 21, right? And they asked about 600, they had about 600 adoptees and 600 non-adoptees. And for those adoptees who were underage, they asked their adoptive parents. Those over 18, they asked themselves, did you attempt suicide? And then they compared those answers to those individuals who were not adopted, right? So that's where, and then they found it 4 times more likely, and that's where they come with. That's where that number comes from. However, I have a lot of concerns with that. First, um, we are assuming that the adopted parents know everything that the adopted, you know, that's assuming that the parents know what their kids are doing. And I had other children. I didn't always know what they were doing, right? There's that, and there's also um, the issue of time, right? It seems the longer it goes, the more pain we have, right? So they stopped it at 21. Mine was throughout the lifetime. And I found no data on first mothers. There was some data on women who who lost their children out of Canada, I believe it was, uh, um, that lost their children due to social services, right? That social services removed their children, but nothing on first mothers as a whole. Um, so using the rates that I had, right, we find that adoptees are 35 times more likely, and first mothers are 37 times more likely to attempt suicide. Not the 4 times, right? Um, so again, those are the numbers. So what do we do about it, right? What do we do about this pain? Well, um, Brene Brown has become, who I want to be when I grow up, and she says, owning our story um, can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as it is running from it for all our lives. Only when we're brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover our infinite power and light. Um, you know, Before my daughter found me, I got married, I had other children, I got an education, I got a job, um, but I wasn't living my true self, right? I wasn't living my true self. I'm looking at the time here, and I don't have much time left. So, but I could tell you how much of a stronger person I am now than I was before, right? We need to we need to face our truths. And when we face our truths, right? Um, um, well, I have like six things in my head going on, but but healing wise, we have to face our truths. But we also have to know that maybe we can't just assume that it does make a difference what woman is raising a child, right? It makes a difference. It makes a difference um, when we break this bond, right? There is this concept in physics called quantum entanglement, right? It's where we know where when we know something about one particle, right, we know something about another, right? Yeah, Einstein was the first one to come up with this, or not one that was one of the first people to come up with this understanding. He called it the spooky action of it as a distance. It doesn't really make sense that that no matter how far these particles are, they could be across the room, it could be across the galaxy. There's a relationship between the two of them, and you can see that relationship. Well, you know, if we had this relationship with particles, right? Don't you think that there's probably a relationship within the mother and child bond? And it really is a long time overdue that our society, the world society, have an honest discussion about the effects of adoption. Um, only until recently, I think have people been willing to see the dark side, right? Society has long painted a picture of how wonderful adoption is. I'm going to skip these because I'm looking at the time and I know that my time is up. But so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Uh, my email is here. The Facebook is the Facebook page is still open, and the survey is actually still open also. If you haven't taken it yet, please consider taking it. My goal is that a year after I pulled the first set of data, I'm going to pull the second set of data to see how uh, the trend is. As with any survey, um, the the results are only as valid as its sample, right? So the larger a sample we get, the stronger the responses are, or the stronger the conclusions can be. So if you are an adoptee or a first parent, the survey can be found from the website. But if you need it directly, I can send it to you directly. I'm going to stop sharing now um, and say thank you for being here. I hope that you heard something that was interesting. Anyway.